Hello, dear listener. Welcome back. Today is a conversation with Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. He's the founder of Strategy and Rest, which is a consultancy firm that works to help individuals and companies harness the power of rest to shorten workdays whilst also being productive. So he presents the contradictory idea that we can actually do more by doing less. And it's the idea of when we're actually productive throughout the day, optimizing those periods and not flatlining an entire day's work, but instead optimizing the absolute 100% out of a few hours and then just turning off in the other hours. So he's the author of Shorter and Rest, two very well distributed and sold books throughout the world. And it is those themes that we speak about in the podcast. Alex gives us a really good take on the neuroscience of sleep because the notion of napping is very involved. We talk a lot, obviously is my favorite part, about the culture of productivity and the cultural backlash to the idea of slacking off or working less or doing 4 hours. The idea that it comes from a lazy part of our psyche rather than it being actually just a smarter way to do things. So a really interesting conversation that I had with Alex here. Before I get into it, I just want to quickly remind everyone that if we've come this far together, we likely have more in common than we do not. So I won't say more about it than that, but I've got a geopolitics and power podcast, but also a website which I totally redesigned throughout the week. There's over 150 articles on there now, so lots of stuff which you might be interested in. And let's just assume that if we've made it this far together, we have more in common than we do not, and therefore there might be other things that I'm working on which you will also be interested in. So subscribe to the newsletter and pump your good juice into the algorithm. Leave a review on this podcast and spread the good word. Tell someone. The hardest part of the content creation journey is discovery. So here's my chat with Alex. I really enjoyed it. He makes the case for why a 4-day work week is more productive than a 5 and how we can maximize our productivity throughout the day by actually doing less. All right, well, Mr. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, thrilled to have you. Thanks for joining me, mate.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be with you.
So I saw an interview where you said that you would rather your work be published in, say, the Harvard Business Review rather than, say, the New Left Review, making a comment on separating your work from the lifestyle category, more or less, and towards, say, entrepreneurship and business. So can you, just to start, can you make your case for why the themes of both Rest and Shorter shouldn't be lifestyle design and work-life balance arguments, but rather arguments for optimizing productivity within an organization, a more scientific argument, more or less?
Right. So I was trying to make 2 points in that interview and in that statement. The first of which is that very often we think of challenges of work-life balance, productivity, and so on as almost exclusively individual ones, right? The way that you deal with stress in the workplace is you develop a personal practice to, meditate more, or exercise more. Work-life balance is about what you as an individual are able to do, juggling or coordinating these various, sometimes conflicting parts of your life. What the good part of that is that it encourages a recognition that we all have choices that we have to make and that we can make about how to design our lives. The downside, all too often, though, is that it gives organizations and structures a pass, right? And the reason that is that's a bad thing is that not only can it be a cover for excusing lots of poor managerial practices or exploitative practices in labor markets or in the structure of careers, but it diverts our attention away from the fact that things like attention in the workplace, work-life balance actually have an intensely social dimension to them. And one of the things that companies have moved to shorter work weeks have taught me is that actually, that collective action is the most powerful form of self-care. That solving these problems that we all have together turns out to yield far more enduring solutions, and ones that that don't construct kind of zero sum situations in which our pursuit of better work-life balance or of more time with family comes at the expense of our colleagues and our work, but which is something that we all pursue and we can all enjoy together. The point about publishing in the Harvard Business Review rather than the New Left Review was that a lot of our conversation about shorter working hours comes out of a tradition informed essentially by by Marx and his descendants. And that, all too often we've thought of the shorter work week or the shortening of working hours as a concession that is wrung by labor from management. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The reality, and the point I wanted to make was that just as thinking of work-life balance as something that is best solved collectively, actually the shorter work week is a win both for employers and for employees, and that so far an awful lot of the drive to a shorter work week has actually come from startups, from small companies, has been driven by business leaders, by company founders, and so I think, and so it should not be thought of as something that is that is a cost to business, but is a way of making businesses more productive, more sustainable, and better places to work for everybody. So that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, okay. It's like a distinction between making the argument as an individual trade-off with their company versus, like you said, like a collective argument, like organization-wide.
Mm-hmm. Precisely. Right. And there are a lot of, and while in Rest, I was writing about people who had the freedom to pretty much design their work weeks however they wanted, right? Famous scientists, academics, mathematicians, writers, and so on. The reality is that most of us don't have that level of freedom to organize our time the way that we want.
No,
Likewise,
higher knowledge workers have it best. Yeah.
Exactly. And even while even if you are working, if you are a creative worker, professional services, you're in professional services or something of that sort, while you have a pretty fair degree of autonomy, you also answer to plenty of people. And so you still have the challenges of coordination and collective action there that that need to be addressed in order to effectively carve out more space in your life for rest, for restoration. And you have the additional challenge of figuring out how to do this in ways that don't put you at odds with the company and with your coworkers.
The way I sort of thought about it was when you made the comment, and you immediately went to Marx, which makes it obviously very political. But I guess there is a lagging correlation between, say, slacking off at work and being a hard lefty, because work should be communalized, and therefore we should all be able to lean on each other rather than this idea of individuality. But that's like a very meta sort of understanding of making the distinction between it. The way I just saw it was the idea of someone optimizing for work-life balance is like this traditional trade-off from what my potential could be in the office or with work. Like it has to be this binary, I sacrifice here so I gain here. And then I think what makes what my understanding of why you said that in that interview is like, because you want to make the idea that it doesn't have to be this binary trade-off. They in fact complement each other, and that makes it this sort of new exciting idea, especially when you have scientific evidence to support it, that wow, we could actually be stumbling across a new way to do business rather than this just new way to say something that we've traditionally known.
Absolutely right. We have seen plenty of experiments with work time reduction that have been accompanied with income cuts, right? So people going to 4-day work weeks, taking a 20% 20% reduction in salary, and I think that is that is a good option to have available for people who can, who can take advantage of it. If you're in a two-income family, for example. But but the thing about that is, first of all, that it still leaves open the challenge of, placing too often placing people who take advantage, who use those programs, at odds with either professional norms or with their colleagues, and it also does not kind of challenge the organization to figure out how to do its and everybody's work better.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the what I'm part of what I'm pushing for here is, first of all, the idea that that work and rest not are not competitors in a good and in a productive life, but rather they are partners, that we should think of them as supporting and sustaining each other.
Yeah,
Likewise, likewise in the organizational context, the 4-day week is not something that has to come at the expense of productivity or profitability or employee salary. That it's possible to, to move entire companies, entire workforces to a 4-day week without cutting salaries and without sacrificing productivity or income or customer service or customer retention or any of the other things that matter.
Yeah, and it sounds like a little bit of a made up utopian idea. Like, come on, Alex, I'm not going to do more. I'm not going to produce more if I do less. And, everyone's got their caveat. I'm in X industry, or I'm in manufacturing,
Right.
or I'm at a restaurant, or I work in whatever. And therefore, maybe it works for an academic like you who's going to write about it. But let's think about real life. So I think
Right.
that gives us a really good sort of launch off for you to give. I would say just the quick thesis for rest, because you're selling this very sexy idea, and obviously nothing is as good as the original text itself, so you can't give away too much. But just to introduce the listener now, what is the thesis of rest? I think people have come to a conclusion of what it is, but in your words, the author's words, could you let us know?
Sure. So the big idea of the book was that rest plays a hidden role in the lives of super creative and prolific people. That when you look at like the daily routines of folks like Charles Darwin or Stephen King or even Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, Nobel Prize winners, generals, people of this sort, that what you find is that the best of them, the ones who did great work and often did so for a very long time, right? Who continued doing work that they loved, work that was rewarding into their 70s or their 80s. Did not work all hours, right? They did. These were not people who who put in 16-hour days or worked in the way that we assume is necessary in order to be productive and to do our best work. Rather, they discovered a pattern in which they sort of learned how to layer periods of intensive work lasting generally about 4 or 5 hours a day, with periods of what I call in the book deliberate rest, that allowed them to be more focused, allowed them time for rest and recovery, but also in those breaks gave their creative subconscious time to work on problems, to turn over ideas, even while their conscious minds were somewhere else, and thereby to come up, essentially to come up with ideas, insights, have aha moments that they would not have had if they had just stayed at their desks and kept looking at the screen for 12 hours a day.
Just trying to think through the wall that they've hit.
Right. Now, also, it turns out that there is a body of work from the psychology of creativity, from neuroscience, that helps explain why it is that this pattern works. And we have in the last 30 or so years learned an awful lot about sort of the brain in its creative state, about the role that naps and sleep play in helping us both have new ideas, but their essential role in as periods for sort of incubation of new ideas, but also just physical restoration. And we've also had some interesting long-term studies that have shown that that individuals who are more attentive to rest, whether that is taking breaks during the day or going on vacations and such, are happier, healthier, longer-lived people who age more gracefully and generally have better lives throughout their lives. So all of this together gives us a model for how to work and how to think about the relationship between work and rest. It identifies ways in which we ought to rest that can help us both do better work but also live better lives, and and it offers a kind of framework for moving away from a vision of work that is mainly about working very long hours in a kind of arms race against your own obsolescence as a kind of model for success, to one that is far more sustainable, that is in its way, I think, more reliable, and that allows us to continue to do the work we really like better, but for longer portions of our lives as well. So that's what rest is about.
That's the skinny on rest.
That's it.
Well, there's
That's
a lot
the
to
whole
get
thing.
in there. I find just because of whatever my interests are, I find the most compelling parts mostly about the historical anecdotes. But then before we get into that, I'd like for you to just describe for us a little bit of the science of sleep, or at least the neuroscience that we understand about sleep, because just as a very high level take, we sort of know that it is this regenerative period, but why does it necessarily have to be 8 hours, and what's the deal with chronotypes, and what about the physicality aspect of it, because there's so much to it. And then also, if you could sorry, I'm piling a lot on this question,
okay.
but also if you could round it out with a nice inflection on actually where the gaps are in our knowledge on sleep, because I think that would be worthwhile to say as well.
Right. I mean, this is a body of research that essentially confirms common sense, right? Everybody has had the experience of sort of going through periods of sleep deprivation or not getting enough sleep, and sort of and we know both the immediate in our own lives, both the immediate and the long-term consequences. I think what the science has done is help kind of peel away some of the fuzziness around sort of the mechanisms that are operating when we sleep that deliver various kinds of mental and physical benefits. So on the mental side, there are interesting studies that show the way that sleep is associated with with consolidation of memories and new tasks. So, and this is tasks whether you are learning a new language or you're an athlete who's learning a new play. That people who in laboratory experiments who learn new words in another language and then take a nap not long thereafter are more likely to recall those words than people who do not. Likewise, far-sighted coaches now recognize the value that rest plays in building athletes, not just physically, in the sense that as they now say, you don't build muscles when you're working out, you build muscles when you're you build muscles in your sleep, because that's when the repair and the kind of the sort of physical repair work happens after a workout. But athletes who are better rested are also better performers. And in the United States, for example, we've seen a shift with the NBA, National Basketball Association, toward recognizing the value of rest. And there's even something now called NBA nap time, which is like, because basketball games in the U.S. are held in the evenings. And so, you might get back to the hotel if it's a road game, like around midnight or so. You still need to eat, and then you've got practice in the morning. And so in the late afternoon, virtually everybody takes a nap for a couple hours. And it is no longer, it's no longer the case that, that sleep deprivation is treated as a kind of badge of honor or shows that you're really tough. LeBron James talks about how he sleeps like 12 hours a night. And he's he's arguably the most fearsome accomplished player.
12 hours.
In NBA history.
What
but
an animal.
he's really pounding it out on the court and in the gym. So, I go for a run and I feel like I need 12 hours of sleep that night. But so, part of what we're understanding is sort of the ways in which sleep, whether it is sleep during the night or whether it's naps during the day, help us consolidate memory of move knowledge of new tasks from sort of short-term memory to long-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
There's also been really interesting studies that look at what the brain is doing in terms of maintenance and repair when we sleep. So
yeah, that's interesting.
So once you get into a really deep sleep, one reason that is valuable is that you are sort of the glyphic system in the brain. So, the brain consists of brain cells, which are the ones that, have the neurons and are doing the firing and thinking. Those are the things that are allowing me to
operate,
to talk to you. But there's also a second system that's essentially maintenance for the neurons. Mm-hmm. And when we're asleep, that system really gets busy and does stuff like, it's doing repair work, it's flushing out sort of amyloid plaques and other things that, if allowed to build up, are associated with dementias and Alzheimer's. And so,
I'm so scared
we've known for a while that sleep deprivation is associated with greater risk of dementia. It's in the last, couple decades or so that we've begun to zero in on, the particular mechanisms, the beta amyloids.
Why it's linked with dementia.
Right, exactly. So, and it does not seem that there were many other ways that the brain has or other times to clear that out. So sleep turns out to be really essential. Now, 8 hours sleep, it's actually more like 7.5. Or if you listen to people who study chronotypes and ultradian rhythms, really what you should be, when you think about good sleep, you should think in terms of blocks of about 90 minutes or so. So 90 minutes in the course of a 90-minute cycle, you go through a couple different stages of sleep, right? There is, and you can think of it broadly as a deep sleep that is more physically restorative. This is when the brain, is doing the repair work. And then there's a part where the brain is actually more active. And that's the time when, for example, you're dreaming. And over the course of the night, the balance between those two shifts somewhat. So when you watch the brains of people sleeping, they tend to be dreaming more in the very early hours before they wake, in the period before they wake up, than when they're than when they're first asleep. Generally, and about every 90 minutes or so, we will wake up or come close to it. And so, if you wake up in the middle of one of these periods, this is when you're most likely to be kind of groggy, and so we wake up more naturally at the ends of these cycles. So what a sleep expert like Nick Littlehales, who works with professional athletes,
what a name,
will advise it. Will say is you should think in terms of getting like 5 or 6 90-minute blocks in every day. That's the ideal. And so that can be sleeping for 7.5 hours straight. It can be 6 hours plus a nap during the day, Or, if you're jet lagged, you play around with that even more. You
Hmm.
might only sleep 4.5 hours and, kind of get up in the middle of the night where you are, but then you would take a much longer nap during the day. And, eventually your body's gonna catch up to the new time zone. But and that's the sort of advice that you want to follow, if you're a professional athlete and you're on tour. You got road games, and so it's really important to be at, as close to your peak as possible when you're on the road.
Hmm.
um as for what we still don't know, there's still plenty of stuff, right? I mean, I think that
Mm.
um I mean, Alzheimer's researchers are still arguing about the importance of or to beta amyloids, for example.
Sure.
Though I think that they are converging more on a consensus that, yeah, this is important. There's still some, but there is still, it's not clear whether there's other stuff that's also implicated, because you do have people who have healthy cognitive lives until the end of their lives, whose brains turn out to exhibit the same kind of physical decline, but it's
Mm.
not accompanied with with
Concerning to
behavioral
hear.
changes or changes in memory. So
Yep.
clearly, there's some complicated stuff going on that we still don't understand.
Yep. Yep.
And then I think that there's still more stuff that we can learn about, let's say, the ways in which the brain operates when we are dreaming. And dreaming turns out to be rather sort of, turns out psychologically to be rather important, right? People who don't dream for long periods end up, show a toll in sort of their emotional regulation and in other things. But I think that it's still really difficult to put people who are dreaming into, big fMRI machines. Those things, partly because those things tend to be pretty loud and wake
Yeah,
people up.
exactly. Mm.
So, I think that while our existing tools give us a sense broadly of which parts of the brain are operating when or are most active when we're dreaming, there's still a lot that we can do in terms of sort of kind of sort of resolving the focus
Hmm.
and getting higher resolution maps that allow us to see what parts of the brain are are operating in sync, for example,
Right.
what parts are connecting together, and how the behavior of the brain in those periods compares and contrasts to brains when we are doing things like trying to solve problems, or
Yep.
we are in flow states or doing
Hmm.
creative work.
Hmm.
So those are two of the things that I think would be really interesting, sort of to work out about sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a fascinating little diatribe on sleep. So, cheers for that. And yeah, I guess it's also one of the most complex phenomena that we sort of have yet to come to grips with within the human body.
Mm-hmm.
You can take a much bigger view and just say we don't understand how the brain really works. We can map it out, but the complexity of it is such that we have absolutely zero knowledge of, well, next to zero knowledge as to truly how it operates. But sleep is certainly one of those things. But it is cool to hear about new sleep research, and I think what you said about wearing a lack of sleep as a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of idea within the culture, especially in my generation, is 100% changing. My mum and dad are both people who have slept 4 to 5 hours their entire lives, and they will just say very not proudly like it's a cool thing, but just like, yeah, I get up at 5 a.m. no matter what time I go to bed, no matter what time of the year it is, no matter what I did before, no matter what I drunk, what I did, and it's kind of like, okay, interesting. Well, I don't want you guys to get dementia, and I don't want to get dementia myself. And like, even if that is the driving force, it's kind of such a good reason to optimize your sleep. And we, like with Matthew Walker's work as well, I think it's becoming very people are recognizing that sleep might actually be just as important as, say, going to the gym, using a physical example.
Yes.
Or even, what's the point in reading a book if I don't get a good night's sleep, because it's not really worth anything. And all these sort of things that I think are really entering the consciousness.
Right. No, I think
Oh, yeah, sorry,
there.
go on.
I would say there are a small number of people who seem to be able to function perfectly well on less sleep than the rest of us. However, that's like maybe 1 or 2% of the population. The problem is the percentage of us who think that we are within that group is much larger. And so, yeah, I think that the smart thing to do is to get as much sleep as your body says you need.
Yeah.
Because sort of the extra, there absolutely comes a point where the extra time that you spend staying up working or studying or whatever is wasted because you're not going to remember it the next day, or you're going to remember it very, very poorly. So
Yeah.
far better to get a good night's sleep.
And even for these high performers who do operate quite well on a couple hours of sleep, we don't know the counterfactual. They might only be operating 50%, and they could have a lot more in the tank.
Right.
But because they're doing quite well by the standards around them, it's like, well, I must be one of these people that operate really well on a couple hours sleep. I mean, Churchill, Thatcher, and Reagan are sort of three very famous examples of people who slept maybe 4 hours in a night, and their lives, and they were very high operators, heads of state, right? Yet
Right.
they their lives ended with dementia, and who knows how much more they could have done.
However, one of the things to remember about Churchill and Reagan, at least, was that Churchill certainly there were periods where he only slept 4 or 5 hours a night, but virtually his entire adult life, he took a long nap in the afternoon. And so, it's a bit like there are these stories about how Thomas Edison never slept. And some reporter was visiting his workshop and asked if this was true. And one of his assistants said, "Oh no, Mr. Edison never sleeps. He just naps a lot." And apparently Edison's thing was he was capable of falling asleep almost instantaneously, and he would do this on a very regular basis. So it wasn't the case that he got 0 hours per night, but he spread it out differently. Likewise with Churchill in the Imperial War Museum in the Churchill War Rooms, which was the underground bunker where Churchill under the Treasury, where he basically ran the war. There is a room there. The last room on the tour is Churchill's bedroom. And after lunch, and usually after a bottle of champagne or claret, Churchill would actually get changed into his pajamas and go to sleep. And he'd be down for like 2 or 3 hours, and the whole facility had to go silent because the last thing you wanted to do was wake up the prime minister, because
not just the prime minister, but goddamn Winston Churchill.
Right. Things were not going to go very well for you if you did that. So Churchill, and so Churchill effectively became what scientists call a kind of biphasic sleeper, right? Someone whose sleep, whose daily sleep is broken up into a couple major but separate sections. And as far as he was concerned, having that long nap effectively, he felt, allowed him to do more work and almost to have 2 days. It felt for him like he had 2 days rather than one. So that's the story on Churchill and sleep.
Well, I love that you brought us into the historical anecdotes, because I have a specific question on that. But I think we may have exhausted sleep and the role of naps. So let's just emphasize that within the sort of rest framework, napping and total a good night's sleep is absolutely paramount to the thesis if the whole idea is going to work. But there is more to rest than just sort of sleep optimization, right? There is the way that you sort of segment your day, very long walks, physical activity. You have brilliant anecdotes about some of the best physicists in the world, but also extraordinary mountaineers. So could you lean on some of the historical anecdotes from a physical sense rather than sleep?
Sure. So one of the things that you see is people incorporating rest into their daily schedules. And by rest, I don't just mean like hanging out on the couch. By rest, I mean a sort of a break from work that is mentally and physically restorative.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that sort of rest can actually be quite active. So, going for a long walk, working in the garden, going for a run. These are all things that turn out to be restful in the sense of giving you both, giving your mind a break and kind of giving you a sort of physical recharge. And so what happens is, at the daily level, layering periods of intensive work and this kind of rest are good because not only do you kind of, sort of recharge your batteries, but when you're working hard on something and you take a break from it, if you've been like in flow, you've been really deeply concentrating on something, you've got a whole bunch of, unanswered problems or things kind of running around in short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
And when you take a break, your subconscious keeps working on that stuff, even if your attention moves elsewhere. And
it's amazing,
so
isn't it?
It is. And so, essentially what you're getting is kind of, you might think of it as like free extra labor from your own mind. The key is to have that period, to have that break kind of while all that stuff is still kind of fresh in your mind. And so, Charles Darwin, for example, would spend several hours in the morning writing, and then he would take a long walk on what the kids called the sand walk, which was this path that was set out on the edge of his estate. And he would sometimes spend an hour or two out there, deep in thought, sort of looking at what's really quite a lovely view, and kind of turning over ideas. And then he would
Sounds
go
so
back
idyllic,
afterwards. It is. But, he would go back and then spend, maybe another hour or so, kind of collecting those thoughts. But the ability, if you have the ability to work in those breaks, that turns out to be a really great way to supercharge your creativity.
Yeah.
Now, for the mountain climbing example, that's an example of the fact that, even people who are in like super competitive fields, who are tremendously ambitious, who may be, racing to make the next big discovery ahead of their competitors, turn out often to have these hobbies that are like physically dangerous, time consuming, that require getting out of the laboratory or, headquarters for weeks at a time. And so, the question is, why is it that people who are sometimes literally pursuing a Nobel Prize willing to take 2 or 3 weeks off and go, climbing in Alaska or the Himalayas? And it turns out that this kind of exercise, this kind of sort of super engaged, kind of immersive, immersive activity, provides both a really great break from work, but also it can kind of reconnect you at a deep level to what it is that you love most about your work. People just choose these hobbies partly because they are simultaneously different from work in some critical way, very physical rather than very mental is the obvious case for most, for lots of scientists. But they also choose hobbies that in important ways reconnect them with what they love best about their work when it goes well. And so, when they talk about, mountain climbing, scientists will often talk about how it's like doing science, right? It's this kind of intensive engagement with nature. There's a sort of intimacy to it. You have this big task that you have to break down into a million little steps that you then, you have to execute. And on the other hand, business people, CEOs will talk about mountain climbing quite differently. That it's about the team, it's about, resilience. Yeah, if you've got this gigantic goal, there's a strategic element to it. Yeah. And so even though it's the same activity, different people, different different people, different professions will identify different things about it that track with what they like about their work, but it's in a very different kind of context, and it often delivers the benefits much more quickly. So, as a bench scientist, you might spend a year working on an experiment, and the results may, you never know if the results are gonna are actually gonna validate a hypothesis. When you're mountain climbing, on the other hand, at the end of the day, you've either made it to the top or you or you haven't.
Yeah, there's no ambiguity to it.
Right. And so it's all the stuff that you like best about your work without the frustrations, and in a much faster, with a much faster kind of delivery system.
Yeah.
And so, I think that having that kind of hobby at, if you kind of pull back, not at the daily level, but at the yearly level, turns out to play another important role in both restoring people's love of their work, kind of re-engaging their passion, while also giving them a kind of break that allows you to really clear your head and focus on something else. One of the things about climbing is you can't think about anything else while you're climbing.
Yeah,
right?
sure. It's got a meditative aspect to it that way, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And for people who are kind of obsessive about their work, having something else that they can obsess about is actually a really valuable thing.
100%. Okay, well, what do you make of this then, Alex? So ultimately, the value of rest, the value of your idea, is that we can both be more productive and therefore produce better and more, while simultaneously not having that traditional trade-off to lifestyle. So you can take long walks, take long breaks, do really good work, potentially even nap in the afternoon, which for any young, ambitious person just sounds preposterous, right? But nonetheless, there was at least for me, there was this stood out to me quite a lot. And this is all well and good for a knowledge worker, a person whose marginal value comes from their idea, whether it's produced on a page or a business room or something else. What about someone who works in more traditional labor? Like their output is determined by their physicality, or even more so shift work. Their output is determined by their presence. Their marginal input doesn't come from the regenerative benefits that good rest might give them. Does this framework still apply for them? How do we think about this?
Yes, it does. I would say, first of all, that one of the interesting things that research on creativity shows us is that the difference between kind of small c creativity, the creativity that we use in order to solve everyday problems, seems at the kind of neural stage indistinguishable from big C creativity. Coming up with the theory of relativity. And so, whether you are doing work that society recognizes as work that makes you part of the creative class, or whether you are engaged in work that requires kind of everyday problem solving, your brain will benefit from from rest. The second point I would make is that an awful lot more of work is, whether we recognize it or not, has this creative dimension to it, right? Things that we call creative work, not because they are creative and everything else is not, but rather it's more of a social designation, right? But if you look at the work of mechanics or repairmen or nurses, we don't call that creative work. There's an awful lot of problem solving, judgment, decision making,
absolutely no doubt
imagination that goes into doing that kind of work well. And so, once you recognize that, I think it sort of follows logically that these, that the things that people like, Einstein or Darwin become less like like alien figures from whom we can learn nothing, and a little bit more like, I don't know, like Usain Bolt or Serena Williams, right? People who are at the very top of their game, who we and from whom we can still learn, even if we can never perform at that level or with that kind of sort of exclusive dedication to the sport. I will never be as good a player as Serena Williams, but there's still stuff that I can learn about how to work out, stuff about the game that I can bring into my own much less impressive tennis game. Mm-hmm. And so I think that likewise, the life of someone like Henri Poincaré or the mathematician John Littlewood, this does not, you can't replicate all parts of that if you are, if you're like a truck driver, or you're a nurse, but there are still things you can learn from those lives that you can apply in order to make your own better. Mm-hmm. And very importantly, things that your bosses and your organization can learn in order to make your life and your colleagues' lives better.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just wanted to ask to be provocative to see if there was something out about it. Because when I thought about asking this question, I immediately thought, what sort of jobs am I talking about here? And a friend of mine, for instance, has an electricity company back in Sydney. It's called H Electrical, but just he's got an electricity company back in Sydney, and he does significantly better than his competition because he's just a really smart guy, but mostly he applies whatever his creativity is, which if you traditionally look at the guy, isn't a creative type, doesn't have a taste for music or drawing or writing or film or anything like that, but he's a problem solver to the absolute max, right? He sees efficiency where other people's don't. So right. That in itself is a type of creativity. And then if you are in this realm, say an electrician, something that traditional society won't say is a creative job, all of a sudden, because you are applying your own creativity, you can, whatever it is, but just do a job faster, do a job better, so forth. It can manifest many different ways. So yeah. I think that really gives rest justice. I think we do rest justice there. And so the way I see it is it feeds perfectly into shorter, because rest is the philosophy. Rest is the big idea. It's justifying that this is possible. And then shorter is, well, now how do we work at applying it, right? How do we actually physically put this into the world? So could you take so basically just with that preamble, can you now give the rest for the thesis for shorter?
Yeah. So Shorter looks at companies that have shortened their working hours without cutting salaries and without cutting, productivity or professional expectations or customer service. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really interested in companies that have moved from 8-hour days, 5 days a week to 4-day weeks where people are working, 10 hours a day.
Sure.
What I'm really interested in is companies that take up the challenge of figuring out how to transform themselves, how to change the way in which they operate so as to give more time back to sort of everyone. Mm-hmm. It turns out, two surprising things are that it is much more a global movement than I expected when I first started researching this. I had first heard about stories of, companies like in Scandinavia who were doing this. And, all right, Nordic countries, not a surprise, sort of, big social welfare states, very communitarian kinds of
places. We're going to talk about that later. I actually live in Stockholm. I'm coming at you from Stockholm right now.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to come to that for sure.
And, there's this sense that you can kind of, people already take a year off when they have a kid. So, moving to a 4-day week, it's sort of more of the same.
Sure.
But, we're also talking about this in places like Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm. Countries that have invented their own words for working yourself to death.
Unreal. Yeah.
The other thing is that it's not just like creative industries or places that have really long, long flexible deadlines. where we're seeing this. I'm seeing this in factories. I'm seeing it in garages, in nursing homes, places that are, blue collar as well as white collar, places where you've got to be, that operate 24/7, places that have like really super clear deadlines and 1,001 metrics for measuring performance and productivity, not just ones
A
where
place
it's
where you
like
wouldn't
very
expect it to work. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, you see it in it's like call centers, right? Places that
Wow, that's wild.
that measure down to the second how
Yep.
productive and profitable people are.
Exactly.
So the fact that and so this is something that is accessible to a lot more industries and a lot more kinds of work than we would think. And there are a common set of steps that most companies take in order to make this happen. The real secret is that most of us actually are already working a 4-day week. And what I mean is that there are studies of multitasking in the office, of how much time we spend in meetings, how much time we lose to interruptions. And the estimates are that most of us in offices lose about between 2 and 4 hours of productive time every day.
No, not
What
surprised.
that means, what that tells us is that the 4-day week is actually already here. It's just buried underneath a whole bunch of outmoded processes and overly long meetings, etc. So if you can get rid of that stuff, you go a long way to being able to do 5 days worth of work in 4. And so, it's about getting meetings under control. It's about using technology better, improving your processes, kind of making some changes to the culture of the office so that people have better respect for each other's time and sort of need to focus. And if you can do those things, then it turns out that you can make the 4-day week a success. So that's the argument of shorter.
I want to get into some specific examples, but before that, I just had to make a comment on you essentially describing the slow releasing poison of bureaucracy and how maybe most people are already doing a 4-day work week. I can tell you, mate, at my old office, we were doing a 1-day work week. There's no doubt about it. And it actually led me to write I do a lot of writing online. It led me to write a blog post. It was one of my first ever blog posts, and it was Slack versus email, because I had entered this organization, sales, SaaS, sort of high energy, high output, high turnover, this sort of thing. And it was the first time I'd ever been introduced to Slack. And I'd just come from a workplace that did all their internal communications via email. And on the surface, you think Slack is a much better product because of all of these hyper efficiencies. But I started thinking, wait a minute, this is not an efficient product at all. Slack is the biggest distractor in the office I was in by 10x the next biggest distraction. And we all know there's a lot of distractions in office already. And it got me thinking, like, wow, I mean, is Slack actually a net good? Does the internal communication benefits you just get completely wiped out by the fact that it's a notification every 5 minutes that distracts you? And I'm sure you have similar thoughts about Slack as well.
Yeah. I think Slack is very much a two-edged sword, and that's one of and Slack is actually one of the tools that when people talk about changing technology use gets invoked most often. That sort of and you learn how to go from responding constantly to notifications to either, depending on the business you're in, ring fencing particular times a day for Slack check-ins, or B, setting aside a couple hours in the day where everyone has permission to turn it off and no one is using it. And
yeah, it requires some serious discipline, though, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
But if you know that no one is using it, then you have, you yourself have no
point for you being there anyway. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and you're also not going to send messages to other people because that's not the time for it.
Yeah.
It's like texting in a theater. Assuming we ever go back to theaters, that
Oh, please! I hope we do.
everyone is supposed to be watching the movie, not watching their screens,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a distraction to others if you do so.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Fuck you,
that's
all those people out there that sit on their phone during a movie.
exactly. Sure.
Please.
So, one of my favorite examples is a place in Glasgow called Pursuit Marketing. And so
Glasgow?
this is the Glasgow. Yeah.
Cool.
So this is the call center that I had invoked a little earlier. And they moved to sort of a 4-day week, I want to say 2017 or so. I talk about them in the book. They're one of my case studies. But essentially, they were in the position where the city is one of Europe's big call centers. Lots of companies are locating there, and it is interesting, right?
Yeah. You wouldn't expect that, would you?
No, I mean the Glaswegian accent is notorious for being difficult,
to understand, but
still,
also impossibly charming. So I guess there's the trade-off.
Exactly. So, but Pursuit Marketing was in the situation where the economy wasn't great. You had more competition. This is an industry where people do an awful lot of job hopping anyway. And so they were struggling to figure out what they could do in order to stay competitive. And they were looking at their numbers and they realized a couple things. One of them was that they had some people, particularly working moms, who were part-time, but they were every bit as productive working 3 or 4 days as people who were working 5 days a week. And so that was the first signal that they actually could, make some changes for everybody. The second was when they look across the week at sales, they found that 90% of people hit their weekly targets by Thursday afternoon. And so, and Friday, either not a lot of business was done, or you might get into a little bit of bonus territory. But fundamentally, what these indicated, and they had years of data on this, for both of these cases, was that maybe with a little extra training, a little more discipline, they could move to a 4-day week without taking any hit at all on their bottom lines. So they were not driven by like a desire to reinvent capitalism or sort of something super high-minded. They wanted to solve really basic problems with recruitment and retention, with work-life balance, prevent their top performers from burning out. And so they implemented a 4-day week, and within a year, their productivity actually went up. Because not only did people figure out the new rhythm, but because they had 3 days off, more time to recover, more time for sort of hobbies and doing healthy stuff, they actually had more energy, even more energy on the job. And, they won a whole shelf full of awards for being a great place to work. And their recruitment rates shot up. And retention,
amazing success story.
And turnover went way, way down in an industry where people conventionally, move jobs about every 6 months or so. And the thing about Pursuit Marketing is that this is an industry where everything about how people are performing, right? The number of calls you're making, minutes per dial, the dollars that you're earning per day,
your conversion rate per hour,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what that shows us is that kind of data can be really useful for identifying those points in the week where you actually could close down with very little impact on your bottom line. And it also provides you data for figuring out, what areas you can maybe train people up, or processes that you can improve in order to sort of improve overall performance. A second example is there is a company called Farnell Clark, which is an accounting firm. So professional services, they're a little less, like weekly deadline driven. Of course, tax season is always a big thing, but Farnell Clark's story with technology is a little bit different, where their transition to a 4-day, to actually a 6-hour day in their case, not a 4-day week, was one that was accompanied with a series of efforts to automate like lower value added processes, right? Sort of basically, automating lots of stuff that previously had been, done by hand, digitizing things where they could, but also extending this to customers. So helping their customers get onto platforms that made stuff like accounting, billing, etc., sort of automated and easier, but also gave Farnell Clark access to that same data on a continuous basis rather than once or twice a year. What that meant was that a lot of the kind of everyday ordinary work of bookkeeping became automated for them, but also it allowed them to move up the value chain. And as they reported, working a 6-hour day rather than 8 or 9 hours gave them more time for professional development stuff and of more time to kind of think a little longer term about where the company ought to go, about what opportunities are coming, they're seeing over the horizon, rather than just focusing down on today's tasks. And so that combination of automating the lesser, the lower value added stuff, and having time for more kind of strategic work has allowed them to do work that basically that they can charge more for, without abandoning their their role as accountants and tax managers and so forth. So I think they're another nice example of a firm that's using a combination of sort of smart technology and shorter working hours as a way to improve working conditions, to make the work more interesting, and because they're in the city of Norwich, which is
England again.
Exactly.
What's up with the United Kingdom here?
Yeah, it's an odd thing, but
Yeah.
they are now competitive. When they're recruiting people, they're now competitive with firms in like London and Manchester, in a way that they hadn't been before. Sort of Norwich is a lovely little town, but it is probably the most famous thing that happened was about 700 years ago when the entire town was excommunicated because of like a riot near the cathedral. So it's not necessarily the place where like top university graduates think of as a destination, but being able to go into this company that's doing really interesting stuff where you can have really rapid professional development and work with interesting clients and interesting technology, and also have a 6-hour day. That's a pretty compelling value proposition.
100% it is
for new workers.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, look, there's also a fantastic sort of restaurant anecdote, but I think we should save that and just encourage people to visit it in the book, because again, there's nothing better than the original text itself.
And visit the restaurant, which is really extraordinary. So,
what's it called?
Baumei. It's in Palo Alto. So, and it is a place that it's literally a mom and pop operation. It's run by a chef and his wife, and it has as many employees as it has Michelin stars. So, but
wow.
It's one of these places that has evolved from like molecular gastronomy to doing really just extraordinary kind of modern French cuisine.
Amazing. All right, cool.
But, the restaurant industry is one of those, all of these industries are ones where long hours are the norm and people kind of move up through, people are really trained to think of success as something that happens when you're working 15-hour days.
Yep.
And, one of the extraordinary things,
especially among the chefs within the industry.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, these are people who are expected to do completely insane hours, and it's only gotten worse with celebrity chefs, and you're starting new restaurants. You got your cooking shows and all this. These people are pulled in a lot of different directions, and so. But even in these kinds of industries, you're finding that it's possible to redesign the work so that you can do, 4-day weeks or shorter work days and still do work every bit as good as the places, where you're still, where people are, like hooked up to the coffee machines and expected to sleep under their desks.
Well, look, it's fascinating and very reassuring to hear that there are companies who you would not think could thrive under any sort of optimized circumstance because they've already hyper optimized, that they can still do it on a shorter work week and shorter working hours. And I guess because we're all just sort of sheeps to whatever is the successful thing, if enough companies can do this very successfully, then there is absolutely no reason why in 10, 20 years' time, a 10-hour working day would be an absolute outlier. And so, okay, very exciting. Let's move on to the Scandinavian example, because as someone who is from Australia and now lives here and has lived elsewhere in Europe before moving up to Stockholm, I get the impression that this part of the world is very misrepresented. Because now this is maybe more of a political point, because actually it is more of a political point. So let's leave that aside. But coming at it from the perspective of rest, coming at it from the perspective of your work, I think there's actually a lot of truth to the stereotypes that exist here as well. And just to give you an anecdote, and you'll love this. I with my business, I reach out to people trying to generate some work, and it'll be like, yeah, Ryan, that sounds great. We're shutting down for the summer. Let's pick this up in September. And these are 10-person organizations that are just shutting down for several months. Yet I know for a fact that they are also brilliant organizations that produce world-class work. And so it's just a bit like there's something in the water up here in Scandinavia. I don't know what it works. Now, my hypothesis is it's very, very cultural. And the way that in America, traditionally, you are rewarded for how long you stay at the office, in Scandinavia, that cultural norm doesn't exist at all. They're just going to measure on your final productivity. So what do you make of this sort of Scandinavian stereotypes that exist in this area?
Well, I think that even in places like Sweden and Denmark, we are seeing sort of movements to shorten the work week. So, there is room there as well as everybody else in the world. Actually, the single biggest current experiment in shortening the work week is happening in Iceland, where the public sector workers, which account for, this is 20-some thousand people, so it's about 15% of Iceland's workforce, moved to from a 40-hour week to 36 hours for daytime workers, and then shift workers are down to like 30 to 32 or so hours. So this is tens of thousands of people who are doing it. I think that but I think that in the rest of the world, certainly in the United States, there has been this sense that that things that happen in Scandinavia are kind of cool, but it's sort of like the elves of Middle Earth, right? They're these beautiful people living in this beautiful place, and they're doing cool stuff. But what in the world does it have to do with us hobbits? And so while there were companies in in Sweden and Denmark and Finland who were some of the earliest adopters of a 4-day week, I think that there's they offer models for how to work, and I think also a cultural perspective about work and time that
I think that's the biggest point.
That has been unique, but from which a lot of us can learn. And actually, the companies elsewhere that move to 4-day weeks kind of discover that for themselves. I had one company founder say, when I'm hiring now, it no longer impresses me that you can work 12 hours a day. That just tells me that you're inefficient. What impresses me
That's a nice cultural signal to notice. Yeah,
exactly. What impresses me is you can get the work done in 6 hours. You have the discipline. You have the empathy for other people. You have the ability to collaborate and to focus and get the work done and get out of there.
And look what you do with all this other time.
Right. And that's what I reward now. And, this again was not a place that adopted a 4-day week in order to reinvent capitalism or, like change
Or
the
make a
nature
political
of the...
statement. It was just literally
Exactly.
for the benefit of their business. Amazing.
Exactly. Because they themselves recognize that if I keep going like this as a company founder in a year, I'm not going to be around here and the company is probably going to fall apart. And, we've been bleeding people. We've been doing, we've been plenty successful at some, sort of on some axes, but we've got real challenges otherwise. And we're not going to solve these problems just by, recruiting people faster. We've got to make some fundamental changes here. And the 4-day week turns out to be like a Swiss Army knife for solving a whole bunch of problems that companies large and small have, and solving them and being this one tool that allows you to solve all these things simultaneously.
100%. I don't know. It would be maybe I'm too optimistic. There's a better word that I had in my head. Can't find it, obviously. But I think within my lifetime, it will a 4-day work week will become a norm, and a 3-day weekend will become a norm, and 2-3 month sabbaticals will also become normalized. Because just to put it in perspective, I still have, but though the idea has been challenged a lot, a pretty Austrian economic worldview. And then I come to Stockholm and then I start learning about the businesses here and speaking to the people here, and I'm like, what the fuck? Like some of the businesses from Sweden. IKEA, Saab, Volvo, H&M, Spotify, Vattenfall, which is one of the biggest green energy companies in the world, Northvolt, one of the biggest green battery producers in the world, and then I'm forgetting some as well. And then also Norway, Finland, Denmark have their own amazing companies that are absolutely world class. Yet, I'm here and it's like employment is ridiculously expensive. Because for many reasons that will bore the listener, but just take it as a granted. This is one of the most expensive places in the world to have an employee. And then you sort of couple that into the idea that they're also taking at least 1 or 2 months of holiday per year. Women are going to get up to a year maternity leave, and then the father is going to get about 6 months maternity leave. And you have all of these factors which would traditionally say to you, this is not going to create a good working environment. It's going to be inefficient. It's going to be unproductive. Yet you turn around and you look at all those companies I just mentioned. This is from a country with a 10 million person population. Okay, so it is it's kind of mind blowing, and I don't know. I think maybe some of the Scandinavian stereotypes really suit, or at least not suit, but they hold a lot of weight, and they are truthful to the rest and shorter narrative.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely. And I think that the thing that I would add is that looking at the companies that I've studied, the cultural stuff kind of follows from the practice. It's not that you've got to, like take Swedish style coffee breaks or, sort of start knitting. It's not like, what's the Danish word? Huga, I think, or
Fika. Fika is the Swedish one.
So, the coffee breaks are, like Danish style coziness. You don't adopt that stuff
yes.
first,
and then it's lagom in Swedish.
It's lagom. I think it's huga, maybe in
that sounds about
Danish.
right. Something like that.
Yeah, but you don't like start with that stuff and then sort of move to a 4-day week. Rather, for companies at least, culture emerges out of practice. And I do see sort of companies solving these very practical, immediate, on the ground problems, but kind of moving to a perspective that that does really resonate more with what you see in companies in in the Nordic countries. And indeed, IIH Nordic, which is a sort of design and sort of web SEO firm based in Copenhagen, they talk about the 4-day week as part of a kind of sort of Nordic way of working. The 4-day week is a kind of, as a schedule that expresses, I think, the values that you are, that you're talking about. And so, but I think that the good news is you don't just have to be in those places in order to have that kind of schedule, or to run your business that way. I think, and I do think you are correct that these things are becoming more popular and edging closer to, if not the norm for everybody, at least things that people take more seriously. Yeah. I'll offer two quick data points. The first is 2-3 years ago, when I first started working on this subject, it was a real challenge to find companies that were doing it. They tended not to publicize it. Now, when you start a trial, you do a press release. You talk about it on LinkedIn. Places are very public about trialing 4-day work weeks. And what that tells you is that the kind of calculation that business owners have is no longer that, we will be seen as these as these like lazy freaks, whose clients are going to all abandon them because they now see that we're not working on Fridays, but rather we're going to be seen as a super productive, cutting edge company that cares about its workers.
Yeah.
And that's a real shift.
100%.
The second thing is we just launched in the United States. A team of people from Kickstarter and Square, from 4-Day Week Global, which is a nonprofit started by Andrew Barnes and Charlotte Lockhart in New Zealand. Andrew is head of Perpetual Guardian, which is a company that quite famously moved to 4-day weeks a couple years ago. We've launched a campaign in the United States that consists of a petition in which individuals can add their voices in support of a 4-day week, but also a pledge by companies to trial a 4-day week in 2022. And companies that sign up for the pledge will unlock some resources and support that we have available to companies that want to try this. And the fact that this has gotten a pretty fair amount of attention in the press, entirely positive attention, and that actually Kickstarter has already signed up to be to trial a 4-day week starting next year, is, I think, a nice indicator of how this has gone from an idea that is completely crazy to one that where the initial thought is, well, it's nice that you can do it, but my company could never do it because of A, B, and C. But I think the last 16 months, lockdowns, going remote, working from home, all of this has shown us that companies are and people are capable of changing how they work far more rapidly than I think we ever thought possible under quite adverse conditions. And lots of us, I think, are recognizing that the way in which we worked before the pandemic is not cast in stone, and it's not something that we should necessarily rush back to. There are things about being able to work remotely, to work flexibly, that are actually pretty good and that we ought to preserve. And so I think a 4-day week is a way of capturing and retaining some of those benefits for people, while also creating an incentive and a system for companies that allows them to bring people back together, back in the office, to kind of re-coordinate schedules and time so that they can work effectively, and to create a kind of win-win for everybody.
Yeah. Here. I couldn't agree more, and I think that something that is that we haven't spoken about, but is totally at the sort of core of the motivation for this idea of working less, or taking or noticing more rest and taking more initiative with rest, is the idea of the individual taking back control of their lives. because as someone who's worked for companies, I just know that it can chip away at the soul, knowing that you're not in control of your time, and you may still love the work you're doing, you may still love the company you're at, but as long as you feel like maybe you have to show face for an extra 2 hours at the office, it does chip away at the soul. And so that's also something to it too. I think the closer we move towards shorter working days, the more a meritocracy could potentially shine through, where because people have their control, they have the personal control of their lives taken back a little bit more. It can come back to, well, now who's most productive gets the promotion. Yeah. Now who is XYZ, that is not the traditional metric, which is just spent the most time at Friday drinks and so forth.
Yeah. No, I think, the 4-day week is a great way of identifying who is really dedicated and sort of interested in their work, and who, identifying the people who are, most interested in figuring out how to do it better. It's also, I think, a great way of, identifying the people who at an individual level are, most productive, the people who can figure out how to do the work in 6 hours rather than 12.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, also able to figure out how to share that benefit with, with others. And it does require giving people more autonomy and more control.
Yeah.
No boss knows everyone's job well enough to tell them how to redesign it and how to do it in 4 days.
Yeah.
You've really got to trust your people, give them space to work out new ways of working, have a trial period in which it's okay to fail, in which you can also share what works well. And, from that, allow the 4-day week to emerge. It's something that is kind of enabled at the top. No company implements a 4-day week without a founder or CEO saying, we're going to go in this direction. But it's actually, operationalized from the bottom up. And that in turn has great benefits in helping people feel happier at work, feel better about their work, feel like the work itself is on a daily basis more meaningful, and helps people feel more engaged, and therefore contributes to them, and all that contributes to higher levels of productivity and output.
Yep, 100%. And I just want to also echo the point you mentioned about COVID. I'm glad you brought it up. I had a question about it, but I think you said exactly what needed to be said, was that the last 17, 18 months have proved how resilient people are to changing work conditions, and that it isn't the case that if you make a small little adjustment, everything's going to fall out the window. I think if you just take the very, very, very broad spectrum look at things, productivity is not only remained stable, but in most cases gone up. And we can look at each other in the eye and say that we'd be lying if people at home weren't taking a little bit more time to themselves than they would have if they're at their office.
Yeah. And I think I know managers, company owners who've said things along the lines of, a year and a half ago, work from home was the hill I would die on. I absolutely knew my company could never do it, and my employees proved me wrong in 3 weeks.
Yeah, amazing.
And that is I think that is a lesson you do not forget if you're a good boss.
Yeah, nice one. Look, Alex, wealth of knowledge, really appreciate it. We're coming up to an hour and a half. I do have 2 more questions for you if you have the time, though.
Sure.
Okay,
No.
And these are non-rest related, non-work related. These are sort of baselines that I try to ask every guest who comes onto the podcast. And they are as follows. The first is, which country are you most bullish on looking into the future?
Country I'm most bullish on looking into the future. I would, sort of patriotism demands saying the United States. The presence of a kind of slightly crazy neighbor knocks out South Korea, though it's a place that has been punching above its weight incredibly for years. However, kind of trying to think about the sort of about the world and trying to think of a place that doesn't have, significant issues or, is exempt from sort of climate change or everything else. You can't really think of one at this point. So
No.
I'm going to stick with, I'm going to stick with home and say I'm bullish about the U.S.
Ah, mate, I'm so happy you said that. No one's had the balls to say the US yet. I don't know what it is. There's this like self-hate people, but the US is not the answer I would give, but certainly the top 5, just because the case for America going forward is much, much better than the case against America going forward.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. And just if anyone wants to figure out why, I point them towards the work of Peter Zeihan, This United Nations. And Alex, finally, this is my favorite question. If you could witness a conversation between any 2 people of history, who would they be? And it can be dead or alive. Just 2 people you wish you could listen to a podcast to together.
Interesting. Two people who had, who would have something interesting to say to each other as well. I think I would go with, let's mix things up a little bit, Churchill and Salvador Dali, because the reason is, Churchill was an amateur painter. Dali had some really interesting things to say about to say about art. I think they also had some interesting, they would have some interesting, political differences of opinion, and both of them were excellent raconteurs. So that's who I'd. That's a
terrific one. I like that. It would definitely be a boozy affair, but I like that it's people from 2 separate fields, 2 different walks of life.
Yeah.
Did Salvador Dali speak English?
I am assuming I'm gonna presume for this thought experiment that that doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It definitely doesn't matter. I don't know. I was just thinking about it.
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Did they live in the same time period as well?
They did overlap.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
So so you could. So it. I mean, it is. It's not like the Buddha and Bruce Springsteen. No time travel is involved.
I love it. You're thinking laterally, mate. 2 different fields as well. Well, look, Alex, I thoroughly enjoyed that, and really do appreciate you giving me so much of your time. Very generous, and thank you very much.
Oh, thanks very much, Ryan. That was terrific.